Hello, everybody. Really nice to have you with us this Friday lunchtime. And good to see some old faces and some new. Lovely to have you here. Thank you for coming. I just got to let you know that I actually went to my daughter's end of primary school event about an hour ago and cried my eyes out. So if I cry during this, it's not because of the architecture, it's just because I'm a total emotional, ridiculous person and get emotional about these things. So bear with me. As some of you may or may not know, I'm Jemima Burrill and I'm the curator at Now Gallery and the cultural consultant for Greenwich Peninsula. And I'm very pleased to have David Kohn here. Thank you for being with us today. Hi. And I suppose I just wanted to introduce you in terms of, well, as an artist myself, that you work a lot with artists, and a work which particularly sticks out in my mind literally is A Room for London, which you masterminded, which is a sort of boat that looked out over the South Bank and the Thames, and you could actually, I did try and get a night there, never managed to, but so wanted to. The idea of kind of seeing the Thames and the bright lights surrounding it, I loved. So I feel that there is a kind of innovativeness and ability to please and make one think about David's practice, which I'm hoping he's going to look at. This is, as you know, or some of you may know, is the fifth talk in the Design District, Meet the Architecture series. And we've had a gaggle of really interesting practices come and talk with us. I just wanted to sort of flag up that we did have David Kohn and 00 talking this summer, and we've actually decided, as I hope everybody is having an opportunity to go away or go on holiday, that we're going to kind of have a little hiatus now, and then we're going to have those guys coming up in September, so please look out for that. I just want to say a little bit about Greenwich Peninsula, where I work, and I kind of have a real soft spot for the place because of the river kind of running around it. But also I'm really excited to see what the Design District, which is what David is here and is going to talk about later, it's a really special place with 16 buildings designed by 8 architects, which offers permanent and purpose-built design studio space for all. So for someone who is an artist, I'd really like one of those spaces because they look really fantastic. So today David is going to talk about his 2 buildings for Design District, and they've been described as sculptural in 3 parts. So I'm hoping he's going to elaborate a little bit about that, whether that's correct or not. I'd like to hear a little bit about that. So just in case you don't know the format, we're going to have, I've got about, so I think 6 questions that I'm going to ask David, and most importantly, we actually want to hear from you. We want your ideas, your input, your questions, because I can tell you it feels like a vacuum. Although we can see your faces, we actually want to hear what you think about what's going on with us. So please send those through. Alex or Polly, I'm not sure, whichever can manage to stay on. They've both got Virgin internet and it's terrible at the moment. So one of them will be asking, feeding those questions in at the end. So please send some through. So my first question, I had this sort of magnificent question about Isaiah Berlin and Tolstoy and Colin Rowe, and basically about being a hedgehog or a fox. And then I got myself in such sort of tangle about it because I couldn't work out whether David was the hedgehog or the fox. And I had this sort of idea that the hedgehog was the divergent and singular one. And anyway, I got in complete, and then David actually explained it to me. So I'm going to say, please, will you explain what that's about? Because I thought it was a sort of a great way of looking at architecture. And you're going to share your screen now, I'm hoping.
Yeah. So thanks for the introduction, Jemima. Delighted to be here. And yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Before I answer the question, I just wanted a quick shout out to my colleagues. So this is our practice who've been working on this project, and the others in the office, and in particular to Jess Lyons and Philip Dring, who have been the project architects for our 2 buildings that are part of the Design District.
I want to ask, is that the top of the Corbusier building or not?
It is, yeah. So
nice.
That's our office field trip last year.
It's so beautiful.
We went to Marseille. Yeah, and lovely. So the hedgehog and the fox. I first came across this story in an architectural context, like many architects. It's Colin Rowe and Fred Curtis' Collage City, which was written in 1978. And in that, they quote Isaiah Berlin's reference to The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is Berlin's most popular bit of writing. And it's based on a poem by Archilochus, which is, while the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one big thing. And Colin Rowe, who I actually met as a student towards the end of his life, I was very influenced by Collage City, and particularly this this idea that there are different types of creativity, and that this kind of opposing attitude to the world, one that everything converges around a single idea, which is the hedgehog, and a different mode of creativity, which is about many concurrent ideas being used together in some continuous invention that doesn't ever kind of zone in on a particular single attitude. And I think at the time that when I started the practice, I felt very much like within architectural education, within architectural practice, there was lots of hedgehog thinking, and that certainly I was interested in being able to borrow from many sources. And also, I think for me, that meant also about being open to what's already there, open to the city, open to context. That complexity is a lot to do with found situations. And the image on the screen is the invitation to an exhibition of our work at London Metropolitan University, where I was teaching in 2009. And the fox is a tangram, which is also the Chinese puzzle used to make our company logo. And in the background is the restaurant that we designed for Bistrotech, which is at the Royal Academy of Arts, called Flash. And there's I guess a hedgehog floating in the ceiling, which is the chandelier designed by Giles Deacon. And this was our first presentation of an idea related to our work and this interest. And I'm also interested in Berlin's idea of pluralism, which he explored through the hedgehog and the fox. You can see it moves on now. So, talking about literal foxes, this is a near neighbor. So, I think it's she, sleeping outside the Sanderson house, which is near Archway. And it's an extension that we did a few years back for Rupert and Rowan Sanderson. Rupert's the shoe designer. And this is where, so the fox is sleeping around about here. And this house is a lot to do with its context. It's borrowing the red brick from the decorative trims. It's negotiating the site with its roof that spreads into the adjacent garden where there's a garage. But also at some point in the conversation, the client's children said, "Ooh, it looks like a fox." And at that point, we started to accentuate the eye, the snout, the decorative brickwork that made the legs different from the body and the head. And maybe this willingness to embrace what's immediately to hand. The foxes live in the garden, so this is very much for them too. And I think probably many people are becoming increasingly aware, and also in architectural education, about the need to address clients beyond the human. And I think this is the view from the interior, and you can see back through the fox's eye to the garden, and the use of different colors, different types of space that perhaps are unexpected. So here, the vaulted ceiling that is making the dining room a more special space than the adjacent kitchen. The expressive use of structure. So arguably, you don't need this much structure to hold up the back extension, but it makes the definition between the different rooms and a kind of open, both room and open plan arrangement. And
it seems like that sort of, though the fox is sort of slightly more exotic and the hedgehog is consistency, and that actually you need both of those in your practice, and you can't necessarily be one or the other.
I think in Colin Rowe's use of the hedgehog and the fox, he does single out some architects, Le Corbusier, as being a fox that wants to be a hedgehog. And I think that connects to Isaiah Berlin's original essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is about Tolstoy being a literary figure that was very much a fox in his thinking, but always trying to reconcile, I guess, the questions raised by the reality of Russia at the time with his desire to be religious, and this kind of incompatibility. And that for Berlin, I think that's at the core of being human, trying to reconcile opposing ideas. That's the nature of being human, the nature of relationships and politics. And so I think that, of course, these things are always coexisting, and arguably if the world was only full of architect foxes, there would be plenty of room for hedgehogs. But I would say probably the 20th century led on hedgehoggy thinking. So I think that there still remains room for more foxes. And I mean, these references on the screen, so James Stirling's conversion of the dock buildings in Liverpool into Tate, and also on the right, Pierre Charot's 1932 Maison de Verre. These are two references by two architects I greatly admire, projects that I've revisited often, that seemed very relevant to the question of the design district, which, so on the left, the possibility of a building having an oversized invitation to come in. So the scale of the columns, their color, it's a very generous, urbane offer. On the right, the Maison de Verre, a building that is completely indeterminate as to its scale. If you kind of squinted and ignored the windows of the Parisian blocks around it, you might think it's several times the size that it is, to do with its gridded facade. But once you bring the windows back in, you realize it's such a sweet little building. And the design district represented a challenge for us, which was how does one both provide that invitation at the scale of the city, but acknowledge that the buildings are much smaller and more delicate and almost toy-like compared to the very large buildings of the peninsula around it. And here another couple of references. This is the Scuola Grande di San Marco, 15th century headquarters for a guild. And again, the idea of creating a guild neighborhood that has a historical context, whether it be in Venice or Antwerp, the idea of creatives having a district which represents them literally within the architecture. So here the use of sculpture, decoration produced by the guilds, but also identifying patron saints and all the symbols and signs that connect it to the history of the guild and Venice. And on the right, sorry.
I think that in the terms of just looking at Greenwich Peninsula and the fact that you have got residential buildings which are, you know, large scale, and the fact that the design district is going to be a completely different scale. And one of the things we've talked about is exactly that kind of notion of Neal's Yard, or, you know, places of a different scale. But I love the idea of building in, I'm not only in the vanity of the artist, the idea of having, you know, the symbols of an artist impregnated onto the building to make sure that everyone knows that that's what's happening. It's a sort of lovely thought. And again, because of the relationship between the decoration that you get on the larger buildings on the site, it's actually really nice to have a different kind of focus on design district.
Yeah, I think there's a literalness to placing these objects, these references, these symbols directly on the architecture. And I think that literalness was, I think, allows a much more direct engagement with audiences and the city, and arguably the kind of hedgehog thinking within the project of modernism, the 20th century architectural style, was about excluding a lot of strategies and collaborations with artists, for example, because architecture was perhaps seen as, at certain points in history, the kind of mother of arts, in which other art disciplines could be accommodated. So the sculptor, and sometimes architects were sculptors themselves, but the role of the sculptor as being within the architectural project. And this is quite different to one of the legacies of modernism, which is to almost turn the whole building into a sculptural form, which is a kind of monologue. The extreme hedgehoggery to say that, in fact, all of the meaning is embodied in the object and it has no requirement for context. I'm suggesting an alternative approach. So on the right here, this is pages from Venturi's, Scott Brown, Eisenor's Learning from Las Vegas in 1972. And I've always loved the idea that what's happening in the left image is happening in the right image too. It's just centuries apart. And now it's you're driving cars, it's fast pace. This is seen on the side of the motorway. And our building, which I'll finally show you, is at the end of the bus depot next to North Greenwich Station. So it has this long tract of public space that the buses travel down. So this idea of an entrance scaled to that public setting, a sign that's speaking very directly about where you're arriving at, that will work in the day, at night it's illuminated, and have something to do with the traffic of the bus. I mean, we talked about the view from the top deck in the evenings and seeing people in their offices. And I think being aware of the position of our buildings on the site, that they had these relationships, and that was an opportunity, that their contribution to the other buildings would be to be a welcoming point that made sense in terms of the public realm.
I love looking at the pillars at the bottom, so James Sterling-like in relationship to Tate Liverpool, and then actually, and now I understand it, the three bits, and then the Hollywood sign. I mean, it is absolutely, it's Vegas or it's Hollywood, and they have a great connection, I think, with each other. Now, I'm aware, because that's what my job is, that
we're going slow.
Yeah, we're going slow, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. What I really wanted to talk about next was, she says, trying to find where she's got the details of what she wanted to talk about next, was, sorry about this, I've got an iPad that doesn't seem to be doing what I want it to do. What were we talking about next, David? Tell me.
So I think you were going to ask
right.
You wanted to ask me about the V&A Photography Centre.
I've got it now, that's right. Well, I think it was really the question of, no, I haven't, the question has literally disappeared. So I think it was about clients, really. That's what I was interested in, actually, how it is to work with something which I'm sure has great restrictions. It's a listed building. You're dealing with displays that have to be very precise. And yeah, as an architect, how do you kind of press your own ideas of how you would like a photographic museum to be? How do you then make it into what they want as well?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, this is probably our most significant built project because of the client, because of its public function. It's the Photography Centre at the Victoria and Albert Museum that opened at the end of 2018. And again, I think a lot of our work was to celebrate what was already there. And I think there was a photography gallery in the same suite of rooms before, but to my mind, they very much turned their back on the 19th century gallery architecture. So, for example, there were short cross walls that meant that you couldn't see this line of lunettes, the semicircular paintings along the wall. And so just being able to bring these back into the view of the room to reinstate the proportions, the grandeur of the gallery, and then to quite deliberately co-opt the historic architecture into the new interior was the project. So, I mean, to some degree, that is also generally the agenda of the Victoria and Albert Museum in recent years. They have a future plan, which is in some ways trying to undo a lot of late 20th century interventions in the museum that were perhaps quite dismissive of the historic architecture. And our role was, the thing that we brought that was new was the possibility of reading between very different objects. So cameras next to photographs, next to the diary of the photographer, next to their gloves and tripod. So a much more narrative engagement with the discipline. And also, this is Stella McCartney's photography that was gifted by Paul just before it opened. And the cases were designed to frame the architecture. So, spanning across the centuries, architecture and object are all now seen as complementary, and the possibility of them being woven into new stories that are made through a visit, through an experience of the gallery. And one of the larger interventions was this dark tent, which in some ways is very alien to the museum. It's this blue metal structure, a room, but in many ways it's also playing with the architecture of the ceiling, the symmetry of the galleries, the fabric-like quality of the coved ceiling. And that made me think of tent-like structures, but also the dark tents of the 19th century that were the very first processing labs that would be taken into the field to capture the chemistry of photography and how to fix images for the first time on surfaces. And I mean, this is the second building of our pair, and they create a street front. So again, in terms of what were our responses initially, they were very urban. We wanted to acknowledge that this was an edge to make two buildings that had a consistent elevation. So if you look at towards the end of the presentation, I'll show you oblique views where you can see them creating a clear face to the outside world, outside of the design district. And I think there are similar concerns at play working in even in a listed context to working in this part of London and trying to make the urban character clearer, that the architecture has a role to play in that.
I think it's also that it must be quite interesting to work with constrictions. I mean, I'm sure if you were given a blank canvas, that would be totally fabulous, but actually being given some constrictions is always what architects have to deal with, and how you use those imaginatively, that's the kind of key. Now, I know that we're going to go on to looking at Stuart Shave's house and gallery, and I'm hoping, because this seems so much about materials as well, and your kind of real love of architectural materials, and I'm hoping there will be a little bit of a talk about that, talking about his workspace, but also his home. And I kind of wondered which you'd done first, and I imagine that he has lots of art, so that how do you as an architect make space that is then going to have art put on it in a sort of an exciting way?
Yeah, Stuart was the most amazing client. He is a brilliant client, but he was like a patron in a way, because for the first 7 years of the practice, we were working with him continuously. And the first project was in fact his gallery. So this was on East Castle Street. Sadly, it's no longer his gallery. He's moved on and done several more projects. But this was his first purpose-built gallery, and it was on the ground floor of a 1950s building. And a consistent theme was, with the other projects that I've shown you, was to use the interventions on the ground floor to somehow bring to life the whole building, so that the legs, if you like, so that these columns deliberately rhymed with the structure above, and they were done in a very hard, crisp grey brick that gave a certain authority to the building that it previously had a recessed facade with no shop front before. Brought the whole building into the city in a more demonstrative way. And I think one of the things about, you asked about his workplace, and one of the innovations we felt within White Cube Galleries was that the offices were the first thing that you saw. You went in and you met the people who worked with the artists. It's a primary gallery, so they work with artists, primary leadership. And that was important in trying to break down this preconception that galleries have this invisible hand to play in promoting the work of artists, and that this was actually work, and there are people involved. So we didn't have a receptionist with it. Yeah. And this is the main space off the street. And having worked with him on the gallery, he asked us to make a home in Norfolk, and this was it was called Stable Acre. There was a stable block on the plan of this building, but you asked about art and being art at home and at work, but actually Stuart was keen to have no art really? So I think this was very much a retreat, so somewhere away from the city where he could leave a lot of the kind of issues around work behind. That's Stuart's. And so you asked about materials, and we used the materials and forms to make the journey through the house very palpable, that this was like a little house constructed in the house proper that was the entrance. And within the structure of the building, we then made further small houses, so idicules. This was a little concrete niche inserted by the entrance that has the same section as the main house. And that's an idea that again finds some connection to the design district. So on the left here is the rear of one of the two buildings, and there are niches in the back of the building, these kind of pocket windows, where we're in discussion with Night Dragon that every year there would be an opportunity for people who work in the district to display prominently in the public realm their work. Yeah, so
I like the idea of that. That sounds good. But also, just actually, the slide before, it always amazes me when you take it for granted, but the light coming through on that photograph, and the importance of how sunshine works in a building, and how a lot of the buildings in the design district are going to be north facing. In fact, the room I work in is north facing, and I don't take it for granted. It's fantastic. I mean, I have a neutral light all the time. But here in your home space, you want something which, that light must change all the time.
Yeah, and I think this is a south facing glazed elevation, and what was great to find, I think it's probably because of the massive concrete floor, it had a very stable temperature despite that, but it did have this very strong change through the day, and particularly through the season. So in the winter, you'd get the sunlight going all the way across the room and up the back wall, So there's a curtain. You'll be glad to hear.
No, nice. That just sounds fantastic. So we were going to go on to your work with Fiona Banner, which obviously interests me. You know, how do you feel like you work the same as artists? Do artists and architects work in the kind of the same way? And yeah, I'm so glad you've got this amazing photo of the Harrier in the Devine Galleries. And then obviously looking at a room for London. So
yeah. So I don't think that artists and architects work in the same way, or certainly, I mean, we've had the privilege of working with a number of artists now, and that hasn't been my experience. I think it's possible to be deeply influenced by these working relationships. We met Fiona when she was working on this commission, the Devine Commission at Tate Britain, and she needed someone to do the drawings that would help her place these two fighter jets, a Harrier and a Jaguar. This was back in 2010. And we were able to get models off the internet of these planes, and we modeled the gallery, and they just fitted in. But what was really eerie and affecting about the project was the realization that the neoclassical architecture and the geometries of this death machine had so much in common, and that Fiona's I guess intuition, and I guess that this is a large part of her work about the beauty of these terrible things and histories, that somehow there's a connection between the architecture that was built as a representation of empire and this this particular plane had seen active service in Helmand. And I think that it was through the drawing and working with her to realize that there was such a direct formal relationship between the two, and it was on the basis of that collaboration, although in that case we were really just helping her do the drawings, that we did a true collaboration from the outset. We did enter the competition for a room for London, and this was the outcome, the Roi de Belge. So it's a one-room venue on the roof of the South Bank that was there. It was meant to be there just for 2012 as part of the 2012 Olympics Cultural Olympiad, but ended up being there for about 6 years. And
I have to say, I still had a fantasy about us floating it down the Thames on a barge to Greenwich Peninsula. I mean, I still live in hope about that, I have to say. It looks so wonderful out there. It's fantastic. I
think if you talk to Alain de Botton at Living Architecture, he still make it possible. But I mean, you asked the question about how artists and architects work together. Probably what working with Fiona Banner did for us was to challenge all of our preconceptions about what were the limits of architecture, what can we do, and her work, this particular project, is heavily referenced A Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And I think the way that Fiona works, well, I understand her to work, and many artists, they have a much greater singular focus on the ideas within the project. And I think I've always found architecture to be much more contingent. The context in which you work is so often complex as an architect, that there's so many issues one has to adapt to that are often evolving, and that the project made me aware of these differences. But that maybe I became much more interested in what Fiona had to say about the project as we went along. And I think for her, the architectural possibilities that this became actually almost like a set for a play. And then she did actually perform Heart of Darkness in the boat that was then televised and or screened within the Queen Elizabeth Hall. that was also an expansion of what was possible for her. And when we came to work on the design district and other subsequent projects, I think we've never lost that pleasure in kind of probing what the limits of practice might be and how one could work with artists, and to be much more speculative about what would be acceptable. And in the project, we've proposed that there are these sculptural figures which is connected to this idea of craft guilds and them having the signs of their crafts on the buildings. And this was, we were hoping to work with Toby Ziegler. That may still happen. There's a big surprise. I can't tell you actually what the sculptures will be, but nonetheless, it's exciting. It's certainly, for me, wonderful that we've been given this opportunity to explore the relationships between these different forms of creativity. And the sign at the top is actually the graphics. This is an old drawing where eventually the lettering was by Mark Al-Khatib, a fantastic graphic designer who's based in our office. And these are Toby's sculptures. This is 2013 Metaplasmus. And I love these because they were figurative but very preoccupied with their making, and they're all very, very ancient sculptures that he's remade using digital technologies.
Yeah,
so yeah, it's become a kind of theme in many projects in different ways of how to work with artists. Yeah,
I think the materiality of Toby's work is really fantastic, and his kind of constant interest in the geometric, which he kind of reworks and reworks and reworks. I think, yeah, he's a great artist. Now, I'm just going to shout out to everybody and say, we would love some questions. We would really appreciate some questions from you. And I know you have some burning questions that you want to let us have. So please just get on the chat. And yeah, we long to hear from those. So I think my question for you now is about colour. I think that I saw an image which was of the Fox House, if that's what it's called, and Sonston House, and it's the red brick, and then there's a vista through, and it has this sort of very beautiful green. And as a fan of actually James Sterling myself, I think of that claw green that it's just such a particular shade, and it seems like you have a big preoccupation with colour, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. We have, since the beginning of practice, been very interested in colour as one of these other potential strands of a project that borrows from many different fields of creativity. And this particular drawing, is by Owen Jones and the Grammar of Ornaments, of polychromy, Egyptian capitals, where I think this very powerful idea that the architecture is not about the white structure, but it is about the surface, the coloured surface, and that the stone that we still believe to be the essence of the architecture is in fact just the infrastructure to hold up the coloured surface. And I think that speaks to two quite different attitudes to what is the origin of architecture. You know, one is on the left. This is Logier's Primitive Huts from 1755. The idea that architecture originated as a structural frame that provided shelter, and it is this skeletal enclosure that is the essence of architecture, compared to this is Schinkel's Charlottenhof Palace in Potsdam, the tent room. This idea that actually architecture is about surface, it's about the enclosure, it's about what is beside you, and that anything else is the prop to sustain the space. And we've gone on to work on lots of projects where this interest in surface over structure and the possibility of actually being quite radical in the atmosphere, the appearance of, this is a grade 2 listed interior in Berlin, the offices of Euroboden, where it's completely transformed the interiors into a contemporary workspace, but through a very minimum of means. And most recently, this is the work of Orit Asheri, the artist who we collaborated with on the interiors for Misbehaving Bodies. And Orit, big congratulations, he just won one of the Turner Prize bursaries for this project.
She is an amazing artist. I think she's totally fantastic. Yeah. This was such an extraordinary exhibition.
And here, quite literally, the architecture of the exhibition was these fabric surfaces, and a kind of tantalizing glimpse of the fabric surface of the two buildings, the design district. So here you can see the structure. It has these diamond-shaped columns that give this kind of oblique sense to the views out, but also you'll see in later views give a slenderness to the structure. Will be cloaked in glass panels that have drawings of an eclipse on it. So you can just make out it's almost like a slipped circle that was a hand drawing in the office and is now being silk screened. That will have I think, an ever-changing relationship to views and context.
That sounds so beautiful. Yeah. So is it an actual circle?
Yeah, no, it's two circles shifted. Again, and it gives it the appearance of a depth. So it almost looks like it's been pushed into the building.
I'm just thinking of your round windows in your work, and the fact that, as an architect, obviously you have to build straight and vertical and horizontal, and yet somehow you manage to slip some beautiful circle into your work.
Yeah, this one is going to be it's a whole facade of circles, so it's up a notch. Yeah.
It's going to be good to see it. So I think we've got one more question, and then we're going to come back to you. So please do get on the chat if you've got anything you would like to ask. And I suppose it was really, the last question was about DD. And one of the things I was curious about was actually putting your buildings amongst others. I mean, it's like you're not kind of, obviously as an architect, you're always putting your buildings within a context, but this is quite interesting because it's a bunch of contemporary architects, and what you felt about working with them, and did you find out about what they were doing and then come up with your idea, or was it just an idea that you came up with quite independently?
So, I mean, this is the street elevation, if you like, of the design district, where you see our two buildings and those of our colleagues. Strangely, we didn't talk much about the designs of the buildings, which I think probably many audiences will find strange. But I have to say, the master plan, I think, was very well conceived and made a lot of the relationships quite clear, so that I think urbanistically it hangs together very well, and I think it'll be completely delightful. And it's the decisions about the distances between the building, their plan arrangement, the sequence of spaces as you move from outside the district into smaller courts and then finally into a large public space. I think every architect inevitably has tried to make something of the urban position of their building. So they all are in fact talking to each other, but it's through the master plan. which was by Hannah, who I think
Hannah Corlett,
we heard from on a previous session. So I mean, Hannah Corlett's strategy, I think, is what binds the projects together. I mean, the other architects are all, I've always admired them all, and some of them are friends, and were friends before we started. And no, it's been absolutely fantastic to be able to work with so many people you admire. Obviously, all really excited to see them finally built out, but also the inevitable relationships between all of the different parts that one can't possibly anticipate. And I think that's also something very exciting about this project compared to other urban strategies. It is the acceptance that many different architects can work together on one project and achieve the kind of variety that I think is more conducive to good background public realm than I think what's much more typical is large urban projects where the architecture is incredibly consistent. And again, thinking about hedgehogs and foxes, I'm not sure anything's gained, but I do think quite a lot is lost. And that variety and pluralism, I think, will be a large part of what makes this a really exciting place to be. I mean, here, this is a photograph taken a couple of months back where you see the frame of our building going up. So that it's like a palazzo. It's facing the bus depot on to the left, and you can see the dome beyond it. And the diamond-shaped columns give it this almost narrower aspect to the front, which I hope gives it an elegance. This is another view now of B4, the second building, and again, they are this kind of palazzo term. I think at the beginning you said they have the buildings themselves have a particular makeup, so they have these tripartite divisions of base, middle, and top, and I think that is about giving them a particular presence within the public realm, that they are figures to be recognized, that they are not abstract, and I think all of our efforts to this is the corner plinth where one of the figurative sculptures will go, and here you can see the relationship to the diamond columns and the light falling on them. I think all of these efforts are to very much engage with the city that's around it, and that maybe, to go back to your first question, being fox-like is as much about combining many different things, but it's also about being open to what's already there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, we actually had quite sort of controversial talk about what it was really about, the expectations and demand for physical office space and how it's changing, and how design districts can help in this way. And during this period, how is it that a bunch of buildings going up like this with office space, how is that going to work? And I don't think I'm not going to get you to answer that question right now, because I actually know that we've got quite a lot of people on the chat. So I'm going to kind of, if you want to come back to that, please, that would be lovely. But Alex, has now Alex frozen? No, he's there. Alex, I'm hoping that you've got a couple of questions, and then maybe we can come back to kind of how COVID is going to...
Shall I come out of the share? Is that a good moment?
Sorry?
Shall I unshare screen?
Yeah, that would be lovely. Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of questions seem to be surrounding kind of creative spaces and what makes them inspiring. The first one's from Rupert, and he's saying, in your career or during your travels, can you describe why spaces you have worked in have been more inspiring than others? And can you give some examples?
That's a good question. I like walking a lot, and I probably, I think I have ideas when I'm walking, and I think a day without a walk is usually a bit sad. I'm lucky I live near a park, but when I used to live quite close to the centre of London, and I would walk as often as I could into the city and back. And I would say, for me, creatively, being in a city is hugely inspiring, rewarding, impactful, and that, I mean, Venice came up here, so did Las Vegas. I think that those are both extremes and quite similar in many ways, but they're also almost microcosms of the idea of a city. And London being almost, still in many ways one of the greatest cities in the world. I think that is what I find inspiring, and maybe what is the connection between an idea about walking in the city and the design district. It is about not just creative space, meaning being at your desk in a room, but actually about being part of a piece of city in which maybe it's using the whole design district is what will make it a really creative place to be. So in a way, the designs of our buildings are deliberately quite simple at the level of floor plates. They have good ceiling heights, they have good lighting, but there's no gymnastics to the work environment. Moreover, I think the things that I hope will spark one's imagination is its relationships to its context. And as you're walking through the design district, probably the pleasure of being between these different buildings, amongst other creatives, the opportunities to bump into people along the way, the conversations that might arise amongst people with lots of creative work going on in the more public parts and semi-public parts. So that would be my response. Cities, walking in cities is probably the examples of what's inspired me most.
I'm totally with you. I find my best thoughts happen when I'm cycling. That's just, that's when I have my cycling and swimming, rather than sitting down at my table with a pencil and a piece of paper. You've actually you've answered Sorsham Gary Hunt's question, which was about designing creative space, and I think that's what's so exciting about the design district, is that it's being designed to be working space for creatives. It's quite unusual in that way. And also there's a photograph I particularly love that you showed, and I can't remember actually if it's on your PDF, but of people coming out and using the outside of the building, so that actually if you're on a ground floor, that you can come out and you can use the space. And there are, I know about the courtyards, that there are courtyards that are designed so that kind of there is a synergy. So absolutely, as you're saying, actually that's what we miss in lockdown. I miss more than anything is coming into Greenwich Peninsula and having a chat with my mates, or going and seeing some art and chatting about it. It's that kind of communication, and that's what you want when you work in a studio. I worked at Great Western Studios, is that the fact that you can have a chat with people. So if people come out of their space and are working in a courtyard, then that seems to be a really good place to start conversations.
Yeah, and I think the courtyard is a type of space, and in a way providing for that type of occupation is what it's offering. The design is what we typically want to talk about design being the materials or the finishes, or I think in some ways is secondary to having achieved that type being part of the design district. And I would say the same in terms of the way we've approached the office interiors, the creative studio space. It's quite like how I've sought out to work in our offices. We have offices in Camden High Street, which I'm very proud of, and sadly not there like many people right now. And I think what I love about them is they're completely generic in the best possible way. They have just about good enough ceiling heights, great natural daylight, really clear rhythmical structure, and it makes them very, very flexible. You feel like you are able to organize your space to match the creative process the way that you work. And I guess that model is quite the model of kind of factory floors, and is perhaps different to models of domestic space, which are also perhaps also suitable for certain types of work. But I suppose what one's reminded of, like, I spent so much time at home now, I so want to get back to a kind of factory style open floor with good daylight, which I think these will be like.
Now it must be 1 o'clock because I have my next door neighbours are completely redoing their house, and the builders basically stop between 1 and 2 and will start any minute now. In fact, they've already started drilling. I'm like, give me a little bit of time. No, there they go. So unbelievable. So I'm going to say thank you so much, David. That was really, really informative. Yes, thank you. And I particularly gave my awareness about legs, the legs of the Fox House, the legs of this building. I mean, I think that we're going to really, really enjoy the Design District buildings. And it's been a real pleasure to talk with you. And
likewise, thanks,
you,
Jemima.
everybody. Thank you so much, David. And thanks
very much for the invitation. Yeah.